Ever since I can remember, my childhood was marked by the simplicity and tranquility of a typical family life. My mother, my younger brother Lucas, and I lived in a small, cozy house filled with memories and shared laughter. I was 8 years old when it all started, and Lucas was 5. My mother, always loving and protective, made sure to create a safe and welcoming environment for both of us. She was the kind of person who knew exactly how to make any day better with a simple hug or a word of encouragement. Our routine was simple, but full of affection. At night, my mother would tell us stories by the bedside, and we loved listening to each one of them. Lucas always asked to hear the same story over and over again, and I enjoyed imagining new adventures. During the day, we played in the sunny backyard, inventing games and exploring every corner of the garden. On weekends, we took trips to the local park, where Lucas ran freely while I tried to keep up. Life seemed perfect, and our home was a refuge of love and safety. My mother took care of everything with unwavering dedication, always ensuring that we lacked nothing. Lucas and I had a strong bond, and even in our small sibling squabbles, we knew we could count on each other. It was in this scene of happiness that things began to happen that we could never have imagined, changing our lives forever. It all started so subtly that at first I hardly noticed. I clearly remember the first time I woke up and found my toys arranged differently. That day, my toy cars were lined up perfectly in order, something I knew I hadn't done before going to sleep. I was confused, but attributed it to my childish imagination. After all, how many times does a child get confused with their own games? However, the occurrences became more frequent and inexplicable. One day, I woke up to find all my books stacked in a precarious tower next to my bed. On another occasion, my wardrobe was completely reorganized, with clothes folded and hung in a way my mother would never do. I began to feel a mix of curiosity and apprehension. As days passed, the nightly rearrangements of the furniture became more elaborate. It was as if an invisible force was tidying up my room while I slept. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, only to see shadows dancing on the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was all just dreams or tricks of my own mind, but deep down, a sense of unease was growing within me. One night in particular stood out. I woke up with a feeling of heaviness on my chest, a dark premonition. I got out of bed and turned on the light, only to discover that all the furniture in my room had been moved to one corner, forming a perfect circle. I was paralyzed, feeling a chill run down my spine. What could be doing this, and why? When I told my mother about what was happening, she initially didn't give it much importance. "You must be dreaming, honey," she said with a reassuring smile. But when the events became more frequent and impossible to ignore, her expression changed from carefree to concerned. We began discussing what could be happening, and she tried to find rational explanations for the inexplicable. My mother thought that maybe I was sleepwalking, moving the furniture unconsciously during the night. But when the furniture began to be rearranged in completely absurd ways, it became clear that something else was going on. One morning, we found the heavy dresser from my room pushed against the door, blocking the entrance. On another occasion, the kitchen chairs were stacked on top of each other, forming an unstable structure that seemed to defy the laws of gravity. The turning point was when, one night, I woke up to find all the mirrors in the house turned towards the wall. It was bizarre and terrifying. My mother, always trying to stay rational, began to become visibly disturbed. She also noticed that smaller objects, like cutlery and books, were changing places, appearing in different rooms from where they had been left. Over time, my mother began to realize that something beyond our understanding was at play. She tried everything, from praying to consultations with specialists, but no concrete answers emerged. Her eyes, once full of confidence, now reflected deep concern. Things reached a point where she began to doubt her sanity, questioning whether it was all a big coincidence or some kind of inexplicable phenomenon. The atmosphere in our house changed drastically. What was once a home full of love and laughter was now immersed in tension and fear. My mother no longer knew what to do, and that made me even more scared. The nights became long and full of uncertainties, and the terror of the unknown settled into our daily lives. Desperate to understand what was happening, my mother decided to install cameras in various rooms of the house, especially in my room. She hoped that the recordings would reveal some logical explanation for the bizarre events that were haunting us. We spent an entire afternoon setting up the cameras, ensuring that every angle was captured. The idea was simple. If something or someone was moving the furniture, we would find out. In the first few nights, we watched the recordings with a mix of anticipation and fear. We wanted answers, but also feared what we might find. For the first few days, the cameras captured nothing abnormal. The furniture remained in place, as if nothing was happening. This only increased our sense of frustration and unease, as we knew the bizarre events were still occurring. The next day, I left for school, and my mother went to work. When we returned home, all the cameras were broken, and the videos were corrupted. It was as if someone had entered our house and destroyed all the evidence we could have had. Fear took hold of us. Who was doing this? And why? My mother, in panic, called the police. However, without victims and without concrete evidence, the police paid little attention to the case. They said they could send a patrol to check, but nothing more. This neglect only increased our feeling of vulnerability. It was as if something or someone knew exactly what we were doing and wanted to prevent us from discovering the truth. With every new attempt, a new disappointment. The absence of any visible presence in the recordings made the phenomenon even more unsettling and mysterious. From that point on, it became clear that our only option was to leave. The house, which had once been a refuge of love and safety, had turned into a place of constant fear. We decided that we needed to move, hoping to leave behind the nightmare that had become our daily life. She believed that by distancing ourselves from that environment, we could finally leave behind the nightmare we were living. The decision was made with hope and a hint of desperation. My mother spent weeks looking for a new house, something far enough away that we could start over. On moving day, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I was leaving behind the home I knew, but also the hope that the inexplicable events would be left in the past. My mother was visibly relieved, her expression reflecting the expectation of calmer days. Lucas, still too young to understand the gravity of the situation, was just excited about the idea of a new room and new places to explore. During the move, I felt a weight being lifted off our shoulders. The new house represented a new chance, a new hope that the days of fear and uncertainty would finally end. My expectations were high, and I believed that finally we could have peace. The days of packing were filled with nervous energy, but also with renewed hope. My mother talked about how we could decorate the new rooms, about the new memories we would create. Deep down, we all wanted to believe that the simple act of moving house would be enough to end the strange phenomena that haunted our nights. The expectations were that, finally, we could have a normal routine without scares or disturbances. As we closed the door of the old house for the last time, a mix of relief and anxiety took over me. It was the end of a turbulent era and the beginning of something new and, we hoped, peaceful. The new house was exactly what we needed, a cozy and welcoming place located in a quiet neighborhood. When we arrived, I was impressed by the spaciousness and brightness of the rooms. My new room was bigger and brighter, with a pleasant view of the garden. Lucas was excited, running back and forth, discovering every corner of our new home. The first nights in the new residence were strangely calm. The sense of peace was almost palpable, as if a heavy cloud had dissipated. My mother seemed more relaxed, and the smile I hadn't seen in a long time began to return to her face. She dedicated herself to arranging the house, decorating each room with care and attention to detail. I began to feel more comfortable, believing that we had finally left the nightmare behind. My nights were peaceful without the bizarre rearrangements that had scared me so much. During the day, we explored the new neighborhood, getting to know the neighbors and discovering the best parks and local shops. The normality we so desired seemed within our reach. However, this peace was brief. One night, I woke up with the strange feeling that something was wrong. Hesitant, I turned on the light and saw that the furniture in my room had been moved again, this time in an even stranger way. The wardrobe was against the door, the chairs precariously stacked. The feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming. My mother ran into my room when she heard my scream. Her eyes full of panic met mine, and we instantly knew that the nightmare had followed us. The new house, which seemed to be a safe haven, was now the stage for the same inexplicable events we had tried to leave behind. After we moved to the new house, the first nights were calm. I wanted to believe that we had finally left the strange events behind. However, it didn't take long for the furniture to start moving again. To avoid further worries for my mother, I decided to hide what was happening. I knew she was already quite stressed with all the moving and the previous events. Every morning, when I woke up and saw the furniture rearranged, I quickly put everything back in place before my mother or Lucas woke up. This became part of my daily routine. I woke up earlier than everyone else, carefully inspecting each room and correcting any changes. It was exhausting, but I felt that I was protecting my mother from even greater stress. It wasn't easy to keep this secret. Many times, I stayed up at night, trying to hear any sound that might indicate the presence of something or someone. But I never heard anything but the silence of the house. This only increased the feeling that something sinister was happening, something I couldn't understand or control. While I did everything to keep my mother unaware of the phenomenon, I also began to isolate myself from other people. At school, I avoided conversations with friends about my home life. I didn't want anyone to know what we were going through. This made me lonely and even more anxious. Over time, I developed a kind of system to deal with the phenomenon. Every morning, I would rearrange the furniture back to its original place. I started leaving discrete marks on the floor to remember the exact position of each piece of furniture. This made my daily task easier and gave me a sense of control, however small, over the situation. I also began to mentally catalog the changes, trying to find some pattern. I mentally noted which furniture was moved more frequently and on which days. This helped me feel like I was, in some way, understanding better what was happening. But in reality, it was just a way to deal with the fear and helplessness. This morning routine became almost automatic. I acted quickly, with precision, to ensure everything was perfect before my mother and Lucas woke up. Despite the exhaustion, I remained firm, believing I was doing what was necessary to protect my family. However, the feeling that something was about to happen never left me. Then, on a morning that started like any other, my world collapsed. I woke up and noticed something was wrong. It wasn't just the furniture that was out of place. My mother entered my room, her face pale and eyes wide with panic. "Lucas is not in his room," she said, her voice trembling. Lucas, my younger brother, slept in a separate room, and he had always been a heavy sleeper. My mother had gone to wake him up for breakfast but found his bed empty. With no sign that he had left on his own, panic began to take over us. We ran through the house, calling his name with growing desperation, but there was no response. We searched every corner of the house, from the basement to the attic, opening closets, checking under beds, behind furniture. Every second that passed without finding Lucas increased our terror. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and fear turned into despair. My mother was in shock, her eyes reflecting the panic I felt. "Where is he? What happened to my baby?" She kept repeating these questions, her voice growing louder and more desperate. I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was falling apart. Lucas couldn't have just disappeared like that. Something terrible had happened, and we had no idea what it could be. We called the police immediately. The officers arrived quickly, but their help was limited. They searched the house, asking questions and noting every detail, but with no evidence of a crime or clues about Lucas's whereabouts, there was little they could do besides register the disappearance. The following weeks were a torment of uncertainty and despair. My mother, devastated, could barely hold herself together. She spent her days sitting in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for Lucas to walk through it at any moment. Her eyes were always red and swollen from crying so much. Every time the phone rang, she rushed to answer it, hoping for some news. But the disappointment always crushed her when the call wasn't about Lucas. I blamed myself for not being able to protect my brother. Every morning, as I rearranged the furniture back to its place, I felt an enormous weight on my heart. I had done everything to hide the phenomenon and protect my mother from stress, but I had failed to protect the most important person to both of us. The nights became even more terrifying. Every noise in the house made me jump in fear, and Lucas's absence was an open wound that never healed. The investigations led nowhere. The police tried to console us, saying they were doing everything they could, but I could see in their eyes that they were also lost. There were no clues, no evidence, nothing that indicated what could have happened to Lucas. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, leaving only an unbearable void. My mother started isolating herself more and more. The nights were the worst. I could hear her crying softly in her room, and I felt helpless. I wanted to do something, anything to bring Lucas back, but there was nothing I could do. The house, which had once been a place of love and safety, had turned into a place of pain and fear. Every day that passed, without news of Lucas, the despair grew. Deep down, a part of me knew that something terrible had happened. No matter how many times I rearranged the furniture, the feeling that we were being watched, that there was an invisible presence among us, never went away. The hope that Lucas would return home became increasingly tenuous, and the fear that we would never see him again became a crushing certainty. As the years passed, I tried to lead a normal life despite the phenomenon that seemed to follow me wherever I went. At school, I met Anna, a wonderful girl who gradually became my girlfriend. We spent a lot of time together, and I found in her a comfort that helped me deal with the fear and loneliness I felt at home. She was the light in my dark life, the safe harbor where I could feel normal. However, the phenomenon did not stay behind. One night, after a romantic dinner, we decided to watch a movie at her house. Everything seemed perfect until, in the middle of the movie, I needed to go to the bathroom. When I returned, I noticed that the living room furniture was slightly rearranged. The chairs were turned in strange directions, and the coffee table had been moved a few inches. My heart raced. This couldn't be happening here too. I looked at Anna, trying to understand if she had noticed anything, but she seemed completely unaware. I decided not to mention anything that night, trying to convince myself that maybe I was imagining things. But the feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming and impossible to ignore. The next night, when I returned to her house, the situation worsened. This time, I found all the books from the shelf piled on the floor. Suspicion began to take hold of me. Could Anna be playing a prank on me? Had she discovered my secret and was doing this to scare me? The idea seemed absurd, but the fear and frustration were consuming me. Started dating, I had mentioned to Anna, in some conversations, the strange events that happened at my house. I talked about the furniture moving on its own, the objects disappearing and reappearing in different places. Initially, she thought I was exaggerating or just making up stories to scare her. Over time, she realized that I was truly disturbed, but it was still hard for her to fully understand or believe what I was saying. My paranoia began to affect our relationship. I was constantly nervous, always alert to any small movement or sound. This constant state of tension was wearing down our relationship. Anna tried to be understanding, but my increasingly erratic behavior was becoming a burden for her. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I confronted Anna, accusing her of moving the furniture as part of a cruel joke. "Why are you doing this to me? It's not funny, Anna," I said, my voice full of anger and despair. Anna was shocked, not understanding what I was talking about. Her eyes filled with tears, and she vehemently denied any involvement. "I would never do this to you. Why can't you see that?" she responded, her voice choked with emotion. The pain in her eyes was evident, and at that moment, I realized how much my distrust and paranoia were destroying our relationship. The situation spiraled out of control, and in the heat of the moment, we ended our relationship. Accusing Anna was the last straw. She was already tired of dealing with my constant state of alert and fear, and this accusation was too much for her to bear. I couldn't believe what was happening. I had lost not only my girlfriend, but also the only support that made me feel normal amidst the chaos that was my life. The impact of the breakup was devastating. I felt more isolated than ever. The loneliness deepened, and the feeling that I was being pursued by something inexplicable only increased. Fear and paranoia now dominated every aspect of my life, and the loss of Anna left a wound that seemed impossible to heal. I distanced myself from everyone, fearing that the phenomenon would follow them too and ruin their lives, as it had ruined mine. Every time I tried to explain what was happening, people looked at me with skepticism or pity, which only increased my sense of loneliness. My social interactions became superficial. I avoided talking about my personal life, afraid that the frightening truth would push people away even more. On the rare occasions that I opened up, the reaction was always the same: disbelief and concern. This made me feel even more misunderstood and isolated. The constant feeling of being watched, that something or someone was always lurking, became an unbearable burden. The fear that the phenomenon could intensify or lead to more personal losses consumed me. I felt like my life was on hold, unable to move forward or build healthy relationships while this shadow hung over me. Distrust became my constant companion. Every unexpected noise, every object out of place, fed my fear and paranoia. I was trapped in an endless cycle of anxiety and despair, unable to find peace or normalcy. The friendships I once valued deteriorated, and isolation became my new reality. The loss of Lucas left an indelible mark on our lives. My mother never fully recovered. Lucas's disappearance case was filed away, with no leads or resolutions, leaving a void that grew every day. The house, once full of laughter and love, became a place of silence and sadness. My mother spent her days sitting in the living room, staring at the door as if waiting for Lucas to walk in at any moment. Her eyes, once full of life, were now dull and distant. She barely ate, rarely left the house, and the nights were filled with her muffled sobs. The spark she had when taking care of us had vanished, replaced by a shadow of deep sadness. I did what I could to take care of her, but the weight of the loss was overwhelming for both of us. The phenomena continued sporadically, moving furniture and switching objects around, adding an extra layer of fear to our grief. Each time something moved, we felt the presence of the inexplicable, a constant reminder that our life would never be normal again. My mother's health deteriorated rapidly. The sadness and lack of will to live drained her energy. She grew increasingly frail, until one day, her body couldn't take it anymore. My mother passed away quietly in her sleep, overcome by the sorrow and emptiness left by Lucas's loss. The day I found her lying in bed lifeless was the hardest of my life. The shock and pain were overwhelming. Losing Lucas had been a terrible blow, but losing my mother to the sorrow of his disappearance was devastating. I was completely alone, in a house full of painful memories and the constant shadow of the inexplicable. I decided I could no longer live in that place. The house that had been a loving home was now a mausoleum of pain and frightening memories. With a heavy heart, I began to pack my things, determined to leave behind that shadow of sadness. I felt that I needed a new start, a place where I could try to find peace. I chose a new city, far from everything that reminded me of the past. The move was difficult. Each packed item was a fragment of painful memories. However, I felt it was the only way to survive. I left that house with a mix of relief and sadness, carrying with me the hope that in a new place I could finally escape the weight of the past. The grief and the burden of memories pushed me to seek a new life in a distant city. I decided that the only way to try to find peace was to start over in a place where there were no memories of the tragedy that had haunted my family. I chose a big city where I could lose myself in the crowd and perhaps rebuild my life. Getting my own apartment was an important milestone. It was a small studio in the city center, a space just for me where I could start over. Decorating the apartment was a therapeutic task. I carefully chose each piece of furniture, trying to create an environment that was welcoming and free of the nightmares of the past. I felt a mixture of fear and hope as I moved in. On one hand, I was relieved to finally have a space of my own, but on the other, the fear that the phenomenon would follow me was overwhelming. In the first few months, life finally seemed to be returning to normal. The strange phenomena that had haunted me for so long seemed to have disappeared. My new job was going well, and I started making new friends. The tranquility I felt was a welcome relief, a chance to breathe and try to live a life without constant fear. I began to believe that maybe finally I had left the past behind. But this peace was brief. One night, upon returning from work, I found all the furniture in the apartment moved to the center of the room, forming a perfect circle. Panic took over me. The phenomenon had followed me, and it seemed stronger and more determined than ever. I decided I would no longer rearrange the furniture. I was tired of living in fear, tired of trying to hide what was happening. If something was trying to scare me, I would no longer cooperate. But this decision only made things worse. The events became more frequent and terrifying. Every night, I found my furniture in increasingly disturbing positions. Chairs precariously stacked, the bed moved to the opposite side of the room, personal items disappearing and reappearing in impossible places. It was as if, by giving up on rearranging the furniture, I had directly challenged the entity or force responsible. And its response was to intensify the events, making them increasingly impossible to ignore. The feeling of being watched grew, and I began to hear strange sounds around the house. Whispers, footsteps, creaking doors. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night with a sensation of weight on my chest, as if something was pressing down on me. I opened my eyes and saw shadows dancing on the walls, creating grotesque and distorted shapes. The terror was paralyzing. On another occasion, I heard whispers coming from the hallway. When I went out to check, I found the front door open, swinging slowly as if someone had just left. The events reached a peak of horror when I started finding messages written on the bathroom mirror. Words like "leave" and "you are not alone" appeared fogged on the glass, even when I knew no one else had access to my apartment. I felt a constant presence, a shadow that followed me with every step. One night, I came home to find all the cabinet doors and drawers open. The silence was deafening, and the feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming. I tried to stay calm, but every little noise made my heart race. The worst experience was when I found muddy handprints on the wall next to my bed, as if someone had been there, watching me while I slept. My mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. The constant fear and lack of sleep were destroying me. I started avoiding leaving the house, fearing what I might find when I returned. The loneliness that was once a relief was now unbearable. Each day became a struggle to maintain sanity while facing a terror I could not understand or control. Determined to understand what was happening and to stop the phenomena once and for all, I began my own investigation. The peace I so desperately desired seemed impossible to achieve while these events continued. I needed to find answers, no matter how frightening they might be. I began scouring the internet, looking for any information about similar phenomena. I read about haunted houses, poltergeists, and even theories about paranormal activity, but nothing seemed to fit my situation perfectly. I needed something more concrete. During my searches, I found only fragments of stories that seemed vague and inconclusive. Many accounts talked about furniture moving on its own, but they were usually dismissed as urban legends or pranks. There was nothing that gave me a clear direction or solution to what was happening to me. I then decided to talk to people who might have some idea about inexplicable phenomena. I visited local historians and even some folklore scholars, but all I got were skeptical looks and superficial explanations that solved nothing. The frustration only grew, and I felt increasingly isolated in my quest for answers. One day, during a visit to the library, I found an old dusty book about supernatural events. The book, though intriguing, mostly contained stories of ghosts and sightings of mysterious creatures, nothing that perfectly matched my problem. However, one chapter caught my attention. It was about phenomena involving the movement of objects, but the explanations were vague, attributing the events to various possible causes, from poltergeists to electromagnetic activity. Despite the lack of clear answers, I continued to record each event that happened in my apartment, hoping that some pattern would emerge. With each new occurrence, I meticulously noted the details, hoping to find a clue that could clarify the mystery. But the truth always seemed to slip through my fingers, further increasing my sense of despair. The urgency to resolve the phenomenon was overwhelming. I felt I was losing my sanity, and each day without answers only increased my anguish. The nights were the worst. I found myself awake, wandering the apartment, trying to find some evidence, anything that could give me a clue about what was happening. I began to feel increasingly isolated. The few people I trusted were starting to distance themselves, worried about my mental state. I clung to the hope that if I could find the truth, everything would return to normal. But that hope was becoming more tenuous. Desperation consumed me, and the need to solve the mystery was now a matter of survival. One night, after an especially exhausting day at work, I returned home with a heavy heart. As I opened the door, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something was definitely wrong. I entered the apartment and felt a strange smell, something I couldn't immediately identify. The air was heavy, laden with a tension that felt almost palpable. I walked cautiously down the hallway, my senses on high alert. When I passed the guest room, a sense of discomfort intensified. I noticed that the closet door in the guest room was slightly ajar. With my heart racing, I slowly approached. I opened the door with trembling hands, and what I saw left me paralyzed with horror. There was a body inside the closet, partially hidden under some clothes and blankets. The corpse of a man, appearing to be around 55 years old, was there, his glazed eyes staring into nothingness. The shock was overwhelming. The sight of the body, the mixture of fear and disbelief, made my stomach churn. The smell was strong, but not yet unbearable. The clothes around were slightly rumpled, with no signs of violence or blood. The scene was grotesque, like something out of a nightmare. I tried to step back, but my legs felt like lead. Desperation and panic took hold of me. Who was this man? How did he get here? My mind spun with unanswered questions, and the reality of what was happening began to set in with crushing force. As the terror and shock sank in, I realized I needed to call the police immediately. Shakily, I reached for my phone, struggling to keep my composure as I dialed the emergency number. The wait for the authorities felt like an eternity, my mind racing with fear and confusion. How had this body appeared in my apartment? What did it mean for the strange phenomena that had been plaguing me? The police arrived and began their investigation, their questions adding to my growing sense of helplessness. I tried to explain the unexplainable, the moving furniture, the eerie messages, but it all sounded like the ravings of a madman. They took my statements, examined the scene, and assured me they would do everything they could to find out what had happened. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning of another terrifying chapter in my life. I recovered a bit of my composure and called the police. When the officers arrived, they carefully examined the scene with expressions of disgust. They removed the body and began asking questions, but I was in a state of shock. The images of that terrible discovery were etched in my mind. The sensation of terror that had accompanied me for so long now had a concrete and macabre form. The discovery of the body was the culmination of a nightmare I could never have imagined. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a horrific way, and I knew I was about to uncover truths that could be even more terrifying than I had thought. After the body was removed, the police began to meticulously investigate every detail about the man found in my closet. I was in shock, but knew I needed to cooperate to understand what was happening. A few hours later, one of the officers returned with a grave expression on his face. "We found something with the body," he said, showing me a small plastic bag containing vials of sedatives. "We need you to come with us for some questions." At the police station, I was interrogated about the man and the sedatives. I explained that I had no idea who he was or how he had ended up in my apartment. The police revealed that the man seemed to have died of a heart attack and that the sedatives found with him were used to induce deep sleep. As the investigators continued to search for answers, I began to piece together the puzzle in my mind. It was possible that this man had something to do with the inexplicable phenomena that had been occurring for years. Then, the terrible truth began to reveal itself. The police discovered that the man was a former nurse with a history of mental problems. He had disappeared from his last job a few years ago, taking a considerable amount of medication with him. Apparently, he believed he was performing some kind of important work by drugging people and rearranging their furniture while they slept. The sedatives were the key to understanding how he had managed to do all this undetected. Every night, he would sneak into my apartment, administer the sedatives, and begin his macabre ritual of moving the furniture. This explained why I could never catch anything in the act, nor understand how the furniture moved without me noticing. He drugged me so efficiently that I never woke up during the events. The revelation was overwhelming. All my fear, paranoia, and isolation had been caused by a disturbed man who had dedicated his life to an insane ritual. The police also found a diary among the man's belongings, where he detailed his actions and his obsession with rearranging furniture as part of a supposed ritual to balance energies and ward off evil spirits. This explanation was both a relief and a new nightmare. A relief because there was finally a rational explanation for the events that haunted me, but also a nightmare because I realized that for all these years, I had been manipulated by a stranger who invaded my home and my life. The sense of violation was deep and terrifying. However, the investigation could not establish a direct connection between the man and the disappearance of my brother Lucas. The police tried to find any link, but there was no evidence suggesting the man was involved. This lack of resolution about Lucas's fate left an open wound, an unanswered question that continued to haunt me. The identity of the man and his exact motivations remained shrouded in mystery. His diary offered only glimpses into his disturbed mind, but did not explain why he had specifically chosen my family or why he continued to haunt us for so long. His obsession with the rituals of moving furniture was clear, but the deeper reasons behind his actions were never fully understood. This lack of clarity about his motivations made everything even more unsettling. Never knowing if he acted alone or was part of something larger left a permanent shadow over my life. The absence of definitive answers about Lucas and the reasons behind the terror we experienced added a layer of pain and uncertainty that I would have to carry forever. After the discovery of the body and the revelation of the events, something remarkable happened. The phenomenon ceased. The nights that were once filled with fear and uncertainty became finally calm. The immediate relief was palpable. For the first time in years, I could sleep without the constant dread of waking up to rearranged furniture or feeling the presence of something sinister lurking. The sense of relief was immense. It felt like a monumental weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The calm that had long abandoned my life began to return, and I could start to rebuild my routine without the constant fear that had pursued me. However, the peace came with an emotional void that was hard to describe. The emotional consequences were profound and long-lasting. Although the phenomenon had ceased, the psychological scars remained. The sense of violation and vulnerability did not disappear with the man's death. Every shadow, every strange sound still triggered a reflex of fear. It took a long time to trust the safety of my own home again. The unresolved connection to Lucas's disappearance continued to weigh on me. The lack of definitive answers about his fate and the inability to link the man directly to my brother's disappearance left me with a persistent pain. The tragedy of losing Lucas without knowing what really happened added a layer of sadness that never seemed to completely go away. Starting a normal life again was a slow and painful process. The memories of the traumatic events were always lurking, ready to resurface at any moment. I had to learn to live with these memories, find ways to manage the residual fear, and rebuild my confidence in everyday safety. I sought psychological help to deal with the trauma. The therapy sessions were essential for beginning to process what had happened and finding ways to move forward. Talking about the events, even the most frightening and painful ones, helped to dissipate some of the power these memories had over me. I also began to rebuild my social network, slowly reconnecting with friends and family. The loneliness that had been my companion for so long was gradually replaced by a sense of community and support. Learning to trust people again was a challenge, but essential for my recovery. The cessation of the phenomenon brought relief, but also a new set of emotional challenges. I learned that overcoming trauma is not a linear process, but a continuous journey of recovery and growth. The fear and uncertainty of the past still haunt me, but now, with support and time, I am learning to live a more balanced and secure life.